my name is Jason Blackard. I am a faculty member in the Department of Internal Medicine at the UC College of Medicine. I'm a researcher by trade, so I study viruses, but as Meg and Krista and others may know, I also am the co-director for the KL2 Scholars Program. So that's our junior faculty training program that is funded through the Clinical and Translational Science Award, or CCTST, here at UC and Children's. So the topic that I'm going to cover today is one of those ones that I'm just going to be very straightforward and honest and say it's a little dry and boring, but it's absolutely necessary. Now, usually you don't want people start saying this is a boring topic, and so I just shot myself in the foot. But I recognize that it's a tricky one. It's also a moving target. So I'd like to give a couple of examples. If you have heard me do this presentation before, there will be some changes. I tried to infuse a few more examples to make it a little bit more practical. And if I'm really good, I'm going to be able to bump out of my slides at some point and actually show you what this looks like in the real world as well. If not, at least I've got screenshots ready for you. So with that, I'm going to say, and Krista and I were talking beforehand about questions. I'm not going to be able to see the chat easily, but if you've got questions you want to type in the chat, that's great. If you want to unmute yourself and ask questions, I'm all for the interruptions and the questions in real time. It'll make, I think, this a little bit more interactive and a little less stale for you to have to just listen to me for a little bit. So bring on the questions as needed. I am going to share some slides. You should be able to see my slides now, right? Just not in the right format. So let me get you there. Okay. So making sense of MyNCBI, Biosketches, ORCID, and PMCID. Again, this gets a little bit tricky. There's a lot here. I'm going to give you several examples, and then I'm going to work you through how this works in the real world. So just so that we're all on the same page, I want to make sure that we're going to talk about the required elements of an NIH Biosketch. We are going to create and share a bibliography that would go into our Biosketches. And then we're going to understand the value of ORCID numbers and PMID and PMCID numbers for your publications. Those are the objectives that we've advertised, and I think I was pretty good at making sure I realigned the content for today's discussion. So keep in mind that there are required forms for your NIH Biosketch. If you have already submitted an NIH grant, then you already know this. If you are getting ready to or thinking about applying for one, this can be a little daunting the first time, but once you get into the swing of it, I think it doesn't actually take very much time. You just have to remember that there is a required form and there is a required format. And it does actually change every once in a while, which is somewhat unfortunate, but I guess NIH is keeping us on our toes. The Biosketch is given here, the link. I am going to show you several examples, so in the next slide, but those are required forms. There is an example or two or three provided on that NIH website. And just recognize and remember that the format does change, not every month, but it does change, let's say probably every other year. And usually the changes are very minor. It's usually just the header that changes. But a couple of years ago or mid last year, the format went through a pretty substantial change. And that's outlined here in this notice number if you want to read more about that. So there are three big elements to this form. One is your personal statement. One is a relatively large section that talks about your positions, your scientific appointments, your honors, your awards, things like this. And then there's a third part that's contributions to science. Notice that grants are not specifically outlined here, but I'm going to show you where they actually do come back. They've just been reoriented within the larger file. So I'm going to show you on the right of the screen is actually what this form currently looks like. The way that I know that it's current is actually up here in the upper right-hand corner. I'm looking at a version that is approved through 2023. If yours is out of date, prior to that, or is not the 2023 or 2024 version, you need to update it, that just to make sure that you're in compliance and don't get yourself in trouble. Generally, this isn't the kind of thing that can get you kicked out of a study section. You mess up your biosketch, except now people are paying more attention to it. And every once in a while, people get comments about this isn't the correct form. This isn't the correct format. So as you're thinking about this, and again, I'm going to show you my own as an example, I want you to think very carefully about your biosketch is you on paper. You can't send in a video. You can't show them your face. They can't see my normally blue hair or my beard, or hear me talking to them. You have to have something else that represents you. This representation of your biosketch needs to have something, needs to have those three elements, and it needs to more or less be a comprehensive look at you at this stage of career, whether you're a more experienced investigator like myself or whether you're on the newer side. So think about what is similar or different with your biosketch and others that you have seen. If you haven't seen others, then you need to be looking at them. It is completely appropriate to ask somebody for their biosketch. In fact, I probably get asked once a week, if not more, for my biosketch, sometimes for grants, sometimes for examples, sometimes for other reasons. I don't know people that don't share this or why they wouldn't, but don't be afraid to ask, and be looking for people across a spectrum of disciplines and a spectrum of career development stage. So Dr. Zeller and myself may have very different looking biosketches than if you are a fellow or a resident or a junior faculty member. And that's totally appropriate and totally fine, but have a look at them. Think about who reviews your biosketch. This is not one of these things that you want to write yourself and then never have another person look at it or make comments on it. You don't need them to comment on every version of it and every single month of your career, but you do need to know that other people should look at this every once in a while and say, wow, this looks really different than mine, or it looks very incomplete. You skipped a big area of research. You forgot to mention a grant. You said something in your description of your own research that didn't make a lot of sense. You used an older personal statement that referred to a different grant than the one that you're applying for, these sorts of things. That last example you see all the time. What comments have your grants administrators provided? So I could provide comments on a biosketch. Krista could. You all could provide examples on your own bios or other people's biosketches, peer review. But your grants administrators, if they're good at what they do, they should also be looking at it too. They may not catch your typographical errors. They may not understand all the nuances of your science, but they should be able to catch that you're using the correct form, that you filled out all three of the sections appropriately, and that the hyperlinks that you may use for your bibliography, et cetera, are functional. So a grants administrator that says you're using the wrong form or you didn't do this correctly is exactly what you want. And then just think about how often you update this. I update it every time I need to change my personal statement, which basically means every time I apply for a grant or I help somebody else with a grant, I need to update that slightly. It doesn't take me much work. It probably takes me a minute or two to do it. I don't have to retype the whole thing every time. So with that, and then are you using the correct form as I've alluded to? So personal statement, positions, contribution. I'm going to give you an example, and I'm also going to start, Krista and I were talking about this right as everybody got on. I have been here for 17 years and have been doing virology research for 25 years. I'm also a professor. Your biosketch may look different. It may look smaller. It may just look different. That's okay. Don't worry about the stage of career development now. Just think about the elements. The top part is pretty routine. Who you are, what your position is, where you're coming from, and making sure that you got the correct form. There's a personal statement. I have seen this personal statement be as short as that first paragraph. Mine has 2 in this version, right? I have also seen a personal statement be the better part of a page. All of those are appropriate and really depend on what you have to say and fitting within the page limit of a biosketch. My biosketch tends to get a little bit long towards the end, so my personal statement might have to be a little bit shortened to accommodate that. If you are a fellow, resident, et cetera, and you have fewer publications or contributions to science, the next couple of stages, maybe this section, your personal statement, gets to be a little bit longer. Totally appropriate. But I'm a virologist who directs a translational research laboratory focused on patient-centered studies of, and I've already told you that. For over 25 years, I've done the following. I am the principal investigator on several different grants, so I mention those. And then I like to finish with a statement that says, I am well suited to serve as, and then whatever the role is for the grant that I'm providing this for. If it's my own grant, then I say as the principal investigator for this current grant looking at A, B, C, and D. Or in this example, this was for Dr. Spearman, who's an ID specialist over at Children's, and I'm going to be a co-investigator on one of his grants. And so I just add a quick statement there. You just want to check and make sure, of course, that it's the right biosketch for the right grant, right? There's this new allowance within the biosketches these days that allow you to put in ongoing research projects, because there's no specific place that grants are included these days. There's no grant funding section anymore like there used to be for a biosketch. But this is a great place, and this is really where you'll see it happen, is at the end of the personal statement or after the personal statement, people will put ongoing research projects or funded research projects, it could also be called, and they'll quickly list what they are. In my case, I put that in because if I'm applying for, in this case, to be a collaborator with Dr. Spearman to study HIV and methamphetamine, it's probably really relevant for them to know that I have my own grant to study HIV and synthetic opioids. There's a lot of synergy there. I have a couple of other virology grants that I want people to know about because I want them to know that I am who I say I am, that I'm a virologist with 25 years worth of experience. So that's that part here. It doesn't have to be any more exhaustive than that, but basically the grant, the title, the date. Some people might put in funding amount, they might put in percent effort. There's no concrete rules for that section here. The next part is your position, scientific appointments and honors. Again, if you are more junior, this may be shorter. I've been at UC since 2005. So you're going to see that I started in 2005 as a research assistant professor. Then I moved to the tenure track. Then I was promoted. Then I got tenure. I've had a couple of leadership responsibilities that are listed in there. I've had scientific appointments. This usually means like if you have adjunct appointments at another university, if you're a member of a professional society, if you're an academic editor for a journal, those sorts of things. And then honors. You can go back as far as you want. Gosh, this one from 1993, I was a junior in college. I could probably remove that at this point if I wanted to. I happen to put it in there, but you don't have to. And then, of course, like I said, you just that may be a little bit shorter depending on what your position is and how long you've been at your current institution or in your current position. Then there's this contribution of sciences section. This is where you have a lot of flexibility. What are your claims to fame? Some people do this in chronological order where they talk about what their graduate work was and then what their fellowship work was, whether it was a postdoctoral fellowship in a lab like I did or a clinical fellowship. That approach is perfectly fine. Some people also do what I do, and I say, you know what, I'm just going to start my expertise from when I became a faculty member. And I do a lot of population-based studies of viral diversity. So I talk quickly about why that's important, and then I give example publications. I could update this if I wanted to and give more recent examples. You see, I went back to from 2004 to 2020 as examples. No hard and fast rules. But I also do functional studies of viral diversity, which means I grow them in a petri dish. Not all virologists do that. So that's a contribution that I have or a skill set that I have that I want to highlight. Several examples there. I've studied for years viral co-infections. So that was my third area. And then I study hepatitis B. You'll notice that this biosketch is actually for a grant on drugs of abuse. And I don't have a section on drugs of abuse here. I need to write one, actually. I need to write a fourth I need to replace one of those 4. I think you're limited to 4 or maybe 5 contributions. You can't give 20. So you have to pick the 4 or 5 most important ones. And in this case, I need to add a drugs of abuse one, and I'd have a short paragraph, and then I'd list several publications. In this case, you are not required, but can end your biosketch with a bibliography. The way that this happens, you'll see in just a second. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of examples here, but a bibliography is a publicly accessible listing of your publications. You don't have to give a number. I did because at this stage of career development, that's important for me to tell people. But you could just say a complete bibliography is available at, and then give a link. I'm going to show you here in just a second how to create that link. That's your biosketch. Now, you can send people a biosketch in document form, Word form, or you can send it as a PDF. I'm not overly worried about people stealing the content, because if they want to be me and do my work, rock on, you can do it. I don't care. But the bibliography is publicly available. But if you make this as a PDF so that you know that the format gets preserved, make sure that this link still works at the end. People need to be able to hover over this hyperlink, even in a PDF format, and make sure that it still works. That's easy enough for you to do at your end, but make sure that it's there. Now I'm going to show you how to create them. So you can create, you need to include a list of, you can include a list of publications. You are not required. People get a little bit nervous about this, particularly earlier in their career. They're like, wow, I just don't have very many publications, so what do I do? Keep in mind, it is not required, but it is highly recommended. Particularly if you have a very common last name, or might be able to find, hard to find because you have changed your last name when you got married or something else. Blackard is a very uncommon last name. I am very easy to find. But if your name is John Smith, people are going to have a hell of a time finding your publications. So providing them with a list is a reasonable thing to do. If you do that, again, it is highly recommended. It must be publicly available, and it must be a federal government website. You can't do this through the University of Cincinnati, through Bitly, through your own website, etc. The website, at least to meet the regulation. Now, this isn't something that gets your grant killed, but to meet the letter of the law, it needs to end with the .gov suffix. Now, again, I'm going to show you how to do this. So this isn't overly complex. Just keep those things in mind. So we've talked about the elements of an NIH biosketch. We've talked about sharing the bibliography. Sorry, I put the wrong section in here. Let me talk about ORCIDs, and then I'm going to come back to how do you actually do that bibliography itself. So give me a 3-minute segue to say, you've also got these things called ORCID numbers. This is an open research contributor ID. This is unique to you. The reason that I bring this up right now is, again, the example that I gave of you got married and you changed your last name, and you published before and after that marriage, or you have a very common last name and might not be easy to find. John Smith, Jane Smith will be very difficult to find in publicly accessible databases. This is very frequently being required by publishers and granting institutions. I would say about half of the time that I submit a publication for peer review, I am actually asked for my ORCID ID as part of that process. They are free and they take about 30 seconds to get. They're very quick. And there is a link here. I'm not going to show you this in detail because it's just that easy to do, but the website looks like this. You register, you create an ORCID ID, and then that ORCID ID stays with you for the rest of your history as a researcher. It will never change. You will never need a second one. It is unique to you, and you have complete and utter control to update it as you see fit. Okay, then there's one other element that we need to think about in our biosketches, and these are a little confusing, so bear with me for just a second. These things called PMID numbers and PMCID numbers. So a PMID number without the C, that is simply a PubMed reference number. So you would prefer that all of your publications are publicly accessible. That is not entirely possible because maybe your newer journals may not have petitioned to be part of PubMed, or maybe you are publishing in an international journal that for a variety of reasons is not part of PubMed. But if you want it to be publicly accessible in something like Google Scholar or particularly PubMed, this is really the way to go. This is assigned by the NIH National Library of Science and is specific to the paper. It's not specific to you, it's specific to the paper. Now, there's this thing called a PMCID number. The distinction is actually important because the PMCID part of this is a PMID number that is compliant, the C, with NIH policies for NIH awards. So it is specific to US publications and specifically to NIH awards. I have collaborators in South Africa that I work with all the time that work with the South African Medical Research Council. And if that work is entirely funded by the South African MRC and there's no contribution from my grants on that paper, then this doesn't actually need to happen for that publication. Versus if those researchers from South Africa help me on an analysis or provide samples for an NIH funded project, then it needs to have a PMCID number as well. These numbers are not hard to get. They are not hard to register for, but you have to be aware of what's being asked and why, because this is a compliance issue and NIH will come back and bug you about it. So those PMCID numbers, that's anything that is peer reviewed. I wrote a review article several years ago for the American Gastrological Association, AGA Perspectives. That's not peer reviewed, actually. So that wasn't something that needed a PMCID number. It also doesn't show up in PubMed. But these PMCID manuscripts, these are peer reviewed. They're accepted for publication after 2008. So they didn't grandfather in anything prior to that. They just started this. So I did publish my first few papers before that time. So I've got some that just aren't subject to this regulation. Most of you, that's pretty far in the distant past. And they also have to have funding that's from the NIH or a cooperative agreement with the NIH or an NIH contract or an NIH intramural program or an NIH employee. You see where we're going with this. Okay, so now let's think about where all this is going to come into play. You want to create a biosketch. You've already seen what the elements are, but you want to create these numbers. This is where I'm going to see if I can bump out for just a second. And I'm going to stop sharing these slides. And I'm going to share instead what this is going to look like for me. I just want to make sure that I am keeping myself honest here and know how many things I want to go through. Okay, so I am going to share with you what this looks like specifically for me. Oops, I did that wrong. This is why you never let the old people be in charge of their own technology. Okay, so here is what I am using MyNCBI to create my bibliography and to keep track of, is it actually complete? So I've already logged in. If I look at this, you'll see this in the slides too, even though we're not looking at them in the moment, they're screenshots, so you'll see this. There's a dashboard. That dashboard, it's updating for just a second. You can actually do searches for your own or others' publications. You can look at previous searches or filters. I've already done this. The first time you ever do this, it'll take a moment, and by a moment, I mean 5 minutes to do this. If you've already done it before, then these automatically get saved, and this will take 5 seconds to refresh. The meat is down here in this bibliography. And I need to point out a couple of things that are a little bit unique to me. One is I do not have 242 publications. So this number 242, most of us know how many publications we have, more or less. The reason mine is so high is because I run a medical student training program, and people are actually uh, connecting their publications through that program with the award that funds that program. And so it shows up at my end. But then you also see there's a bibliography link here. I'm going to show you here this in just a second. And then there's actually there's one citation that I have that needs some attention. I'm going to show it to you. Let's just start with clicking on the link though. It usually will self-populate, and you'll see there's actually a couple that right off the bat, you see the examples that I mentioned. It's 242 publications. That's not as many as I have. The first thing here, this is not my work. This is work that was done by students that are connected to the T35 training grant that I have. I think this is probably the same situation that Dr. Zeller knows about. So several of these things, I'm not Mark Rothenberg and don't work on eosinophilic esophagitis. I can't even say it, much less work on it. But then you start to see my publications. There I am, Blackard. This is my graduate student doing some viral work. There's another same graduate student. Here's some people that I've worked with in Botswana and South Africa, where I'm a co-author on work. This is some work led in mine. So you see there's a big exhaustive list. Now, this is just the list. If you want to manage that, meaning you want to add something to it, then you can easily go back to PubMed or to NCBI and do a search for your own name. You can also look at, well, once you've got some of this done, where are the issues? Where are the issues that are arising? Because really what you're trying to do, this is a compliance issue. You're trying to make the NIH happy, trying to make sure that you are giving them credit for the grant that they gave you. First thing you're going to see is I had one, you're seeing it right now, that said I had an issue. This one's super annoying because I have tried this probably 10 times and it keeps coming back. And every time I go in, I say, you know what? I manually entered this citation. And the reason I manually entered it is because at that time I was not sure that the NIH or that this particular journal was being seen by PubMed, and I wanted to receive credit for that publication. As you can see though, PubMed is recognizing that publication with the same title, the same citation, the same journal, etc. It's just giving it more detail. So I'm going to resolve this issue by checking this appropriate option and resolve and close. You see, it doesn't take a whole lot of time. You didn't have to do much work. Now I'm back in my list of publications, 240-ish that don't always include mine. And I'm going to scroll through these because I want to show you a couple of things. For the most part, everything is in green on the right, and that's what you're looking for. Those are compliant. So this publication by this student that is attached to my T35 training grant is in compliance and has a PMCID number listed here. Do I actually copy and paste these elsewhere? I do not. I see no need for that. Every once in a while you might be asked for them, but I couldn't tell you the last time I was. Now I'm scrolling through, everything is in green. Now, one of the reasons it's in green is because I take pretty good care of this. I go in a couple of times a year and make sure that everything is okay with the bibliography. You'll see that there's one here in gray. Gray is compliant, it's just not applicable. So the reason this isn't applicable is this particular study. One of these people is a UC medical student. One is a collaborator in Botswana, and then myself. This was a review article. There was absolutely no funding obtained for this study from the NIH. Therefore, it was exempt, and I didn't have to connect it to an NIH award. More examples, more examples. Here's another one that I did that had no NIH award or funding that was associated with it, so it didn't need to be connected to that award, and is in gray. The rest of them are green, 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 green. I'm looking for one in red. I don't think there are any here. So I'm going to stop, I'll bump out of that for a second. I'm going to pull the slides back up because I want you to at least see what this would look like. So we got the slides again. What you will see is Okay, so I logged in. I showed you the dashboard just so that you saw the bigger picture. That's what that looked like. Then I went back and I specifically focused on the publications because that's what we're using it for. In that case, that are specific to me, meaning that they are my publications, not just associated with my grants, I have 125 citations. And I have to do a mental check and say, does that sound right based on how I report things in my CV and my annual review? And I say, yeah, that sounds about right. And then, of course, you see that it also tells me that I have one citation that requires attention. Now, I just showed you that one, but the one that requires, if we just look at the original 125, there they are listed as an example. Number here may not quite match up, but for reasons that we don't need to go into, but these are all my publications. They're usually in chronological order by the newest being at the top. And then I'm going to look at this one that requires attention because that's why I'm in this system and trying to make sure that I get full credit for all the work that I've done. The one that comes up is this one here in red. We didn't see this one. I showed you mine earlier, but because it was on a different page. This is not my publication. This is one that's associated with my grant, but I am not the senior or co-author on this. But it shows up as red. It says that it's non-compliant. This is really what you're looking at. And it usually means that somebody did not connect the NIH funding for this publication to this electronic record. It usually means they didn't even try, meaning they forgot about it. And that's pretty common when they're students, actually, because students don't know about this. They don't really have a reason to know about this. So they may not know that this needs to happen, and the more senior investigators may forget about it. So it's shown, because it's connected with my grant, I probably need to reach out to the senior author and say, when you have a moment, please go in and connect this publication with the T35 training grant for your student. Thank you. Please and thank you. Okay, so if you've never done that before, ever, and I mean you're brand new, because if you've done this before, then I'm giving you more details than you want. Dr. Zeller's sitting there saying, I've already done this before. If you've never created before, then you need to access it and update things. And this is where we go back to this original page and we do a manage my bibliography. And for the first time, we at least type in our own name. And I type in Blackard J or Blackard JT, my middle initial, and I look for publications and I'll get a list. I'm not showing you that today, but it's very straightforward to do. Again, you can also manually add in citations, or you can import them from PubMed. So you have a couple of different options. But if you're adding anything, here are your options. You can pull them from PubMed. You can pull them from a file, like a Word file. Think your CV or a resume, or you can do it manually. Don't do this manually. You'll hate yourself. If you have lots of publications the first time, that's a painful way of doing it. Let PubMed do its work. But recognize that there may be things that are not in PubMed that you still want to add. So you might have to add every once in a while something manually. Usually that means it wasn't peer reviewed, it was published in an international journal, or it's something very new, meaning the journal is new and not connected to PubMed, or it's an EPUB ahead of print, meaning it's been accepted for publication, but hasn't been formally published. And then you get to make the decision that it's not in PubMed yet, but I know it got accepted. Do you want to manually add it in now so that you get credit for it now versus in a couple of months when that journal communicates with PubMed? Personally, I don't do that anymore. I don't take that extra step. But if you are on the younger side and have perhaps fewer publications and want to make sure that people think that you're getting credit for every single publication that you have, you may want to go through and add those in manually as they happen. Nothing wrong with doing that. So again, I showed you an example that I was running, one example that I was running into. Here's another one. What this is saying is I manually entered this because I wanted this publication to show up in my Biosketch before it had actually been formally published. Once it got to PubMed, it looks very similar, doesn't it? I mean, the authors are the same as they should be. The title is the same. Really, the difference is it looks like the journal name changed, except it didn't. I refuse to write journal names as abbreviations because I'm not smart enough to figure out what the abbreviation is. So I just typed the whole damn thing out. But that got me in trouble here because Journal of Clinical and Translational Science got shortened to something else. So that's really all that happened here. Nothing major. And I didn't defer. I actually just didn't update my slide. There were a couple of others that were new for me, meaning that when I did create this slide last, I had a couple of new publications, the same one that's listed here, the Visiting Scholars Program. And I also had a review article that I had published with a medical student that hadn't been updated at that point. If you take care of doing this a couple of times a year for most of us, then this will be more than adequate. Okay, now I've given you a lot of information about Biosketches and all this, but I want to let you know of a couple of resources that I think are really, really good, strong resources. The Academic Research Service, which is the Department of Internal Medicine's grant office, did a training session that they recorded through WebEx about a year ago. And its sole focus is Biosketches and other support. So I have talked about Biosketches. I haven't talked about other support today, but if you want to hear somebody else's perspective about it or get even more detail than I provided today, this is an excellent publicly available video recording. It takes about an hour if you start and finish it. Of course, you can scroll through it and get to the parts that are relevant to you. There are periodic updates or changes to the NIH Biosketch. I mentioned that previously with the NOT that's listed here. It's the same thing that I mentioned earlier. That was the one that came out in May 2021 or took effect May 2021, telling you what the changes are. If you don't know what the old version is, then you probably don't care about what the changes are. You just go with what you're being told to do now. There is a frequently asked questions section provided here. And then for those of you that are creating Biosketches for the first time, you can actually do that in using a template without having to manually type everything using either this MyNCBI or back on NCBI. In other words, they'll take the template and you add some of your information, but you don't have to type every single step. If you're interested in learning more about NCBI, there were a couple of references that I already provided in the previous slides, but they're mentioned here again. NCBI is really where you're creating and managing your bibliography. At the early stages of your career, you may only want to check this once or twice a year. At the latter stages of your career, particularly if you're publishing quite a bit, you may want to publish more. Again, don't get overworked about, oh my God, I freaked out and I did something wrong. These aren't the type of things that get grants kicked out of a study section, but they are the type of thing that people will say, your grants administrator will say, you are not in compliance and you need to take care of this because it is their responsibility at the university or at the institute level to take care of that. And it will sometimes get you comments in study sections about, you didn't really use the updated form, or you didn't tell us enough about yourself in your personal statement, as an example. ORCID, I'd already mentioned. ORCID's really quick, really easy. PMID and PMCID, when you're trying to remember the difference because you frequently forget, as I do, there's a nice link for that. It doesn't take very long to read through this, but it's all about that compliance issue. The PMCID compliance is compliance with NIH policy, which means that it has to be an NIH-funded project or an NIH-funded investigator. If it's not, then it doesn't apply. And with that, I am done with our slides. So I will stop sharing so that we can see each other a little better and see if you have any questions. I went faster than I meant to, so but that's good. We have some time if you've got any questions. And just so that you know, because you should ask, we are going to share the slides with you. So if you're registered here today, you'll have these. And even if you're not registered and want to share them with somebody else, I'm not proprietary about my stuff. Feel free to share it with others if you think it'll be helpful. And I think Krista will remind me, but we are recording, so we should be able to link to this through CTR Online, which is where we house a lot of our recordings that become publicly available as well. So thank you, and let me know what questions you may have. How many people?
Hey, Jason, can I ask a question?
Yes, please, Tim. How are you?
Good. Hey, good. That was really good. I maybe missed part of it. I had to step away really quick. For your biosketch, for like each study that you, for each grant that you do, how much do you change it to address that specific study and like the people? And so like I've seen some people with their different grants like mention like a sentence or two here about like that study or something. But
yeah, so Tim, you always ask great questions, so thank you for getting us started. That's a really thoughtful question. That now I'm not going to say that I have the perfect answer. My approach is I tell people about the funded grants that I have. And that's what they're asking for anyway. This is not a place where you tell them your entire funding history. The best that you can do is provide your current funding. Now, you could provide your current funding that's relevant to the reason that you're submitting the biosketch. But many of us, that kind of implies that you've got so many grants that you've got some to choose from. And that's a place of luxury that we're not all in. So I tend to just put down the grants that I currently have funded. And that means that even if they're going to expire the day after I submit the biosketch, but as long as they're currently active. Now, the second part of that is, do I reorder them? Do I put, the more important ones at the top and the more important ones at the bottom? I generally tend to leave the ones that are specific to me, that Blackard is the PI at the top, and the ones where I'm a collaborator more towards the bottom. But I don't know I've never been told to do it that way. I just am a big fan of, gosh, if I submitted the grant myself, I want people to see that one first. Otherwise, there are no specific rules on that, and you don't have to include this section. So if you are, I'm trying to think of the examples where I wouldn't suggest including that section is if it's going to be blank. Ongoing research funding or ongoing research projects, and then it's blank, don't put the subheading, move on, pretend that it doesn't matter. That won't get you in trouble because it's not a required element. But why focus on something that you don't, why allow people to focus on something that you don't really want them to focus on?
And if you're a mentor on a grant, like you're mentoring someone, in your lab, do you put what your role is going to be in that, that introduction paragraph on the grant?
You absolutely can. You are not required to. So it really depends on, let me answer your question in two ways. If you are doing exactly what you say, where you are mentoring, let's say you're mentoring a fellow or a resident on a project. If that person is funded to do that work through your project, then it's already listed there. You don't need to list it a second time. If that student, resident, or fellow has their own funding to do that project, but you are serving as the mentor, I think it's fantastic to list that because it shows that you're collaborating with people that you're mentoring, et cetera. You'll notice when I showed it earlier, I mentioned the KL2 Scholars Program. So I have protected time to serve as the co-director on that grant. But Dr. Zeller is actually the PI on that grant. So it's not going to say Blackard, it's going to say Zeller. But I have protected time on that grant, and I want people to know that as a tenured professor that I mentor people. I think that's an important thing for me to highlight. I run a training program for medical students. That one's actually in my name. So it says T35 NIDDK summer research or short-term training program for medical students, and it gives the dates. What you can do that I do not do is you could actually give a very brief description of the goals of the grant. You could include the amount of dollars associated with the grant. You could include your % effort associated with the grant. I don't bother with that. I don't have any strong feelings about whether it needs to be included or not. Thank you. Natalie, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
I just have a question. You may have covered this. I stepped out also just for a second, but I get a little confused. I was hoping you could clarify, like with MyNCBI, like showing my manuscripts up and everything. Like sometimes if it says it's non-compliant, if it's just shown up on PubMed, like how is I get a little confused with like if it can't be like shown open access yet just because the journal's like embargo period, like how does that work? And then can you just—
It's a great question because it is confusing to all of us, including us that have been doing it for a little while. So the first and foremost that you probably want to know is, regardless of where you published your manuscript, you want to know if it is accessible on PubMed. Now, that can be a little bit ambiguous or onerous to figure out. If it's Nature, Science, Journal of Virology, something really obvious, there's 150% chance that it is available on PubMed. But if it is a new journal or something that is, I don't want to say obscure because I don't want to badmouth the journal, just something that not everybody's heard of, they may not have associated themselves with PubMed. And the easiest way to know that is to go to their homepage. The Journal of Underwater Basket Weaving is either associated with PubMed or they're not. And you can go to their homepage, the journal homepage, and if they are, they're going to say in big, bold letters, indexed in PubMed, Google Scholar, Scopus, these sorts of things. And if it's not clear, one of the other things that you could do is say, I'm going to look at something that was published in this journal within the last year or so, and from their webpage, from their homepage, their table of contents, and I'm going to look for one of those articles in PubMed and see if I can find it. That's rare that they're not, but it is not impossible. The biggest reason that you don't see things in PubMed is because when you get an acceptance letter that your article has been accepted, you're getting that directly from a editor or a managing editor. There is anywhere from 1 minute to 1 year that it may take them to get that information about the accepted publication to PubMed. Some people do it immediately. I mean, literally within 24 hours. I find it kind of crazy that it even happens like that, but it does. And some people make a policy of waiting up to a year. And the reason they do that is because they don't want to put your submitted and accepted, but not galley-proofed final version up for other people to see. And it's really up to the journal. And so in that case, you have a publication that's been accepted and will be on PubMed, but isn't available yet. And that's where I was saying earlier, you just get to make a choice. Do you want to wait and just sit there and be patient? Or do you want to manually enter your own publication? And either one of those is perfectly fine. And you can always edit the manual one that you entered. And then when it becomes publicly available through PubMed, you can simply replace one with the other.
What about like manuscripts that just show up, like the abstract is in PubMed, but the full text is not there? And then we try to submit it through MyNCBI and it says, no, we need like tables and—
so that happens a lot now, and it's super annoying. You've done this, so you know what I'm talking about. Those are almost always, I think they actually are always, they're falling in that category of what we just talked about. It's been accepted, but it hasn't been formally published by the journal, because it's the journal's responsibility to send your galley proofs, and I mean galley proofs, not even the proofs, the final PDF to PubMed. It's not your responsibility to do that. But journals know to do it, but they can take anywhere from a minute to a year to do it. So if you're in a hurry and you're trying to get credit for that, for your bibliography, for your biosketch, for something else, you can manually do that, like we said. But when you manually do it now, only within the last couple of years, the NCBI really has said it's not enough for you to just tell us that it's been accepted. You got to upload some files. And usually what you have to upload or what they're asking for, it does say the tables and the figures and all this. But what I do is I say, I'm going to go to, every journal will create a PDF, right? There's a PDF option when you have a manuscript that's been accepted. Even if you submitted PowerPoint, Word files, Excel files, there was a place to create a PDF. I actually send that, and it's an upload function. They say upload the manuscript associated files. They can really actually be in any format. If I remember correctly, last time I did it, you could do Word, PowerPoint, Excel, or you could do PDF. And then you'll get a message saying, we've received your request, and they usually take 7 days to review it. And then you'll get your manuscript has been accepted into NCBI and given the following PMCID number. It's not acceptance of your manuscript. It's just the ability to connect it to PubMed more quickly, because it will happen. Unless the journal somehow manages to literally lose your article, which I'm the only person that I've known that ever happened to, but maybe it happened to Meg. And it's exceedingly rare. But you got formal indication from an editor that it's been received and all the communication. And if they're giving you galley proofs, then they're working on it.
And is that like, at that point, like, doesn't the journal own the copyright? So are you even allowed to do that? Yeah,
so copyrights are a really tricky thing. And I'm just gonna say up front that I always find them a little confusing, because in many cases, exactly as you said, the journal owns the copyright. But what you'll see is that for most journals, there's actually an exception for the authors to use it for educational purposes, which means that you can always, to my knowledge and in my experience, you can always download your own article, and you can always share it with other people at other educational institutions without any sort of trouble. Now, you couldn't charge somebody for that, because you do see sometimes, right, that journals charge you $10 to download an article. You can't charge them. I don't know anybody that would anyway, but that sort of thing. So where the copyrights get tricky is less about sharing your information with other collaborators or with other institutions, and more when it's a graduate student. Because sometimes graduate student PhD dissertations are copyrighted as well by the university. And then there's that trick of, well, it's copyrighted by the university, but now it's also copyrighted by a journal. And that is very doable. In fact, all of us that have gone through a PhD program have done that before. It's just that it gets a little confusing the first couple of times. You have to, again, it's waiving, it's what's the purpose? How are you going to use what you created? If you're just sharing it with your colleagues at other academic institutions, I don't know of any examples where that is problematic or a copyright infringement. Now, I reserve the right to be wrong, but I don't know. I haven't experienced any examples myself in 25 years or know of others. Great question, though, because it's confusing, because almost every time you publish, you're signing something that is a copyright. It feels very legal, and it is, but it's interesting if you can get through if you can sift through the legalese, you'll see the exceptions where you as an author have the right to your own information, as long as you provide as long as you don't charge anybody for it, and as long as you give the journal citation, which is something that we always want to do anyway, right? Because we want to get credit for our own work.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, this came up because I had to upload something and I didn't.
Yeah, no, it's confusing. Trust me, the language is really kind of wonky at times. And
yeah.
not something that we're used to thinking about, or many of us are not used to thinking about. Yeah. Other questions?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I was actually just scanning through my bibliography, and I have a really old publication years and years ago. And it is, it should have an NIH grant associated with it. But then when I kind of look up the investigator, that grant doesn't actually show up in the list of their awards. And so I'm wondering how I can list that grant but not be out of compliance. Is there a way to do that?
Absolutely, great question. And this happens every once in a while, given, you know, when we publish, how we publish, where we publish. Now, let me ask you one question. When you say very old, how old is very old? What year?
It's not very old. It's I think it's back in 2018.
Okay, that's fine. But the reason I was asking,
it just feels like forever ago that I
understand. I understand. The reason I ask is because if you were going to tell me before 2008, I would say it doesn't matter, right? So then my second question is, at your end, does it show up as non-compliant? Is it red?
It's red.
Okay.
Yeah, it shows up in red. I did have to manually enter it though, because it wasn't indexed in PubMed, interestingly.
Okay. So that is a rarity, but it can be that sometimes what happens is that the way that we think the funds were associated with this grant just don't quite show up the same in NIH. And what I mean by that is, you know, your investigators' funding, you would want to make sure with the publication as it appears in PubMed that there is some acknowledgement of that. If there is no acknowledgement of that, it may have been forgotten when it was submitted, and there's not a whole lot that can be done. This isn't going to get you in trouble as much as you can also send an email. There's always a way to send an email to NCBI saying, I don't know how to do this, but this grant should be associated with this. Sometimes what I also find is that we forget who the grants belong to. It's not always, you know, it may not be your PI's grant. So for instance, you know, like with my training grant, and Dr. Zeller might have the same experience, that sometimes people think that the PI is funding their work when the training grant is actually funding their work. So, and the other issue, the other challenge is that might not be something that you can do. It might have to be, if you are not the senior author or the corresponding author, almost certainly your PI has to do it. So I have to go in sometimes and say, now I can manage my own, but every once in a while, particularly for the training grant ones, somebody else entered a publication that they associated with my grant. Usually when they got that far, they were compliant, right? Because they knew to do it. But what I don't know is how many publications are out there that should have been associated that aren't. But I would probably just go back to the PI and say, and check the acknowledgement section, first of all. And then second of all, check and make sure that you know whose grant actually funded it, and then ask that person if they can do it. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah. That's a good example though, actually, because when they're non-compliant, it's rare. But when they're non-compliant, they sometimes take a moment to figure out what's the issue. And sometimes it's a typographical error. I mean, to be quite honest, sometimes we type people's names incorrectly. And that can get us in trouble without us realizing it, for instance.